much has been picked up on about lots of NHS workery and all the rest of it. We'll move on to that bit in a second. But specifically when it comes to the strikes and the BMAs and BMA and who's to blame and all the rest of it, what do you make of some of the stuff he said today?
Well, I think there's a real attempt by the Conservative Party to paint the NHS workforce as a bunch of radicals. And I just don't buy it. You know,
NHS workforce or the union, the BMA?
Well, the point is the union are being supported by the workforce, right? So the votes for these strikes are overwhelming, and they are by the same people who have been consultants for the past 20 years.
The workforce is going to be led by guidance from the union, though, right?
Well, no, because every time they go on strike, they have to have a ballot across the workforce, and we actually have quite strict union laws in this country. So you need at least 50% of people to vote. You need at least 40% of the total workforce to have voted to go on strike. So this isn't the case of just sort of a minority leading the rest of the workforce. The workforce are in favour of these strikes. And so you've got two explanations. One, which is that suddenly all doctors have become radical leftists who just want to bring down the government. Or the other one, which I think is a little bit more plausible, is that these are very normal professional people. But if you cut people's wages by 17% over a 13-year period, then you are going to get some kind of backlash. Now, how would you end these strikes? Now, I know people say this 35% they've asked for is very dramatic. Now, clearly that is, right? But I think you could probably end them tomorrow if the government said, we will restore your pay over a 5-year period, right? Yes, we have cut your pay since 2010. We see that you're upset. We will, over a 5-year period, restore your pay to where it was in 2010. I'm sure they would go back to work.
I was just about to respond, but I'm going to bring you in instead, Alex.
I think there's a lot of... Michael makes his case very well, the first being the strategic concession that 35% was an unreasonable demand, which is true. And but let's remember the timing. It became even more unreasonable as others around them in the public sector paid less than doctors, settled for lower rises. And that's when it became so ultra that the BMA was demanding what they were demanding. And I think, too, look, what Michael says about voting turnout is unarguable. You're correct. That that they've turned out in the numbers that they have and in the percentages that they have. But the Home Health Secretary is right too that the BMA has become a great deal more hardline. And whereas once it was a much more kind of pragmatic voice of the industry, there are, it seems to me, some at least involved in that now who see it as their full-time job to be agitators. And if you don't like the point in principle, consider in practice that they said they were more willing to talk with the government in Scotland than they were with the government in Westminster because they were more in tune with their values.
Yeah.
Not actually about what they were negotiating, but because they preferred the government north of the border. And when that happens, it's a good demonstration they're not just negotiating on behalf of their members.
You're absolutely right. How would you respond to that, the Scotland thing as well?
I mean, I think the issue here is what has changed, right? So you're saying that the doctors used to be pragmatic, now they're quite militant. Now, the demographics that go into medicine haven't changed, right? The same people, when we're talking about consultants, because they'll mainly be older, they've been in the workforce for a very long time. So if these doctors have been radicalised, it's not by left-wing ideology, it's by 13 years of Tory government.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I have a specific answer on your question, because believing it wasn't rhetorical and you're asking what's changed, I think in part the answer is the age at which people think themselves worthy to go in and take full representative positions within the BMA. Once upon a time, it was seen that you would become, a senior consultant and a super 50-something leading surgeon or whatever. Now, there are people who barely get their certificate before they think, right, I'm going to become a full-time agitator.
But I think the problem is there you're falling into the same trap, which is to see the union action as a result of decisions made by the leadership, when in fact there's a huge mandate across the workforce. So you do have to answer the question, what has changed? Why is the workforce backing strikes when they didn't used to? Because it's very, very rare for junior doctors and consultants to go on strike at the same time.
It was.
Is it that suddenly there is this new radical demographic that have all got medical degrees and are now senior doctors? Or is it that a group of very professional, hard-working people have come to the end of their tether when it comes to 13 years of Tory government?
So it's interesting. I think that one of the reasons the government is sensibly trying to make the distinction that Michael denies is that any government that's seen as going to war with the NHS it will have been signing its own death warrant and will find nobody willing to treat it in the environment that I point to. So if you're having these kind of disputes with the medical profession, you are not just, in my view, right anyway to point to this, but it's sensible to seek to peel away the more extreme end of the union representing people in that discussion from the workforce as a whole, because there's a great wellspring of support and positivity about our health service. there is one thing that the Health Secretary could do that I think would help us as a country, which is to seek to examine what the NHS does well and does badly. Because it isn't like any major institution. It does some things well, it does some things badly. The trouble is we treat it so much like a cult at the moment, in which we are all members, by the way. It's treated so much like a cult that we don't get any meaningful conversation about results.
Let's talk about the other aspects of what Steve Barclay had to say as well. I think I've got a clip, some of this too.
I know as Conservatives, we know what a woman is. And I know the vast majority of NHS staff and patients do too. That is why I ordered a reversal of unacceptable changes to the NHS website that erased references to women for conditions such as cervical cancer. And that is why today I am going further by announcing that we will change the NHS constitution following a consultation later this year to make sure we respect the privacy, dignity and safety of all patients, recognise the importance of different biological needs and protect the rights of women.
What did you make to that, Michael?
I'm a bit exasperated by it, I suppose. And the reason I say that is because we've got 7 million people on waiting lists for NHS care. You've got people waiting for a year for a hip replacement. And we have a health secretary standing up and getting an applause line out of sort of shifting the deck chairs when it comes to what patient goes to what ward. Now, I don't actually personally have particularly strong feelings about trans people on hospital wards. I think it's up to hospital management. I can see how there are sort of potentially conflicting rights here. But the idea that this should be sort of a piece of political football just seems nonsense to me. This is the kind of thing that should be decided by NHS managers in response, in conversation with experts, and yes, maybe some people in the health department. The idea that this should be a sort of manifesto issue, a general election issue, when we've got 7 million people on waiting lists. You've got to remember, the number of trans people is very, very small. So essentially what you're saying to someone is...
Well, no, that's
yes,
as defined in the last census, and not as we know that life will have massively moved on from there, and there was some contention about how the question was asked in that census anyway.
Well, it's still going to be very small, isn't it? So the chances of going into hospital and being next to a trans person is relatively low. Now, I can...
Sorry.
The trouble with Michael's position is that the guidance that the NHS has, this is unlike where you were saying people who were railing against policies that didn't exist. This was current NHS guidelines that said transsexual people, transgender people, could be placed on single-sex wards on the basis of the gender with which they identified, rather than the gender that they actually were. So that was the status quo. And the trouble is that position had been reached by NHS managers having the kinds of conversations with experts and consultants groups and so forth that you were suggesting they had. So for me, this is the kind of thing where political leadership is required. And the elected person says in the end, yeah, all right, that's all very nice, but I'm going to tell you how it's going to be.
But he's the health secretary, right? So I don't think intervention from a health secretary is unwarranted. But this is a conference speech, right? This is your key message to the party faithful and the country. And his key message to the party faithful and the country is that this very small issue, which doesn't affect many people, is now the centrepiece of the Tory when it comes to the NHS.
It affects a lot. I mean, you're saying it's a small issue that doesn't affect many people. Many women, in particular, watching this will really be yelling at their screens saying a man who just wakes up one day, sticks his pronoun badge on and a skirt on and says, today I identify as Shirley, so therefore I am going into the same ward as you, the same this or the same that and then the other. That is a big concern for women. They will say that we've worked very hard to get access to protected spaces and single-sex spaces and all the rest of it. So they will really be pushing back, saying that against you saying it's a tiny issue affecting a tiny amount of people.
Well, so there's two issues here. So one distinction that I think it was unhelpful that Steve Barclay didn't make is there's this question of self-ID. Does someone who just says I identify as a woman get to stay on a female ward? But he's saying all trans people altogether. So you can have someone who's lived half their life as a woman, who everyone recognises as a woman, who's legally identified as a woman, and they're banned from those wards. So I think that's one issue there. The other thing I do think we need to remember is that we do have some evidence about how many people are concerned about this in hospitals, because there have been freedom of information requests to hospitals to say, has any woman who was born a woman complained about trans women on their ward? Zero. So that's what I mean when I say this seems to be a problem which has been blown out of proportion for political purposes.
It can't be zero, it must be about the reporting process in that case. I accept it's going to be very low, right? But given that people have talked about their experiences online and so forth, that must be about how the NHS logs complaints rather than about there actually being zero complaints. But I wanted to talk about something different to the conversation you two were having, because I think it does matter to many people.
Make it very brief,
when you think about, only women can get cervical cancer. But cervical cancer guidance in the NHS had removed any reference to women for fear of offending men who are pretending to be women.